It depends when that description was made, in a way. At the time that we did the apartment, Surrey Hills was a very different place. It was a very different place. It was actually, and look, to some extent it still is quite a tough neighbourhood, but it's softened up a lot. It's much more hip and much more sort of humanised now. Well, you know, not that I can often say this, but I was at a wedding in India, which happened to be Daniel Droger's wedding, and he was describing to me how he had begun the process as a consortium. They owned, a group of friends owned the building, and they had decided to renovate it together. And he was describing to me how he got along with his architect and how he was finding the process. And, you know, I tried to say architects, he wasn't exactly happy. And I tried to say, you know, architects are not actually always good at first impressions. Give the guy a chance. And he said, oh, okay, and we moved on. And then a few months later he rang up and basically said, I gave the guy a chance and now I'm finished with him. Do you want to do it? Yeah, it was 5 floors of apartments, and they owned them different members of the group owned different floors. And we were asked to do actually a renovation that allowed them to occupy them. It was really floor by floor, strata, bring it up to date, deal with the car parking. It was quite a pragmatic job. And some of the people wanted us to do the whole fit out and floor for them, and some didn't. Some just wanted the shell. And so that's the way it began. You know, sometimes jobs kind of unfold in a way, and I guess it was when we realised that the fire stair used to be in the nose, and it was at the point when we realised that the fire stair had to move, that we suddenly realised that it's almost like you shake up the pieces, then you start to think, oh, actually there might be other opportunities here. And it also involved a reshuffling of the ownership amongst Daniel and Lyndall and the rest of the group. But it was really a liberation of all of the component parts. And then suddenly there was, once we put balconies on the northern corner, all this floor space opened up. And that's a kind of quantitative, technical rule that comes out of council. But it was like all that space suddenly added up to something more than just a little bit here and a little bit there. We suddenly had extra FSR. I guess the traditional way of building in an urban environment is to build to the edges. You know, you go up to your edge, the site, there's no setbacks or requirements to have setbacks. But because of the kind of bucket of space that we had, we couldn't fill the whole floor at the top. And so we weren't talking about just an extrusion, add another floor. We had to, in a way, add both open space and indoor space. And that's how the design really began, was, well, how do you add something that doesn't just look like it's always been there, because it can't just simply continue with another full floor. What are you making then? Are you making a roof? Are you making a courtyard building? Are you making something that completely retreats from the edges and is invisible? So it's really that moment of knowing that we were going to make an outdoor space and an indoor space drove a kind of re-look at what's the relationship between something new and a beautiful, robust brick warehouse. You know, everybody loves Paris, but there is that idea in Paris that there are walls of buildings, and then above the wall is a kind of playful roof zone where people do quite wild things in actually quite an old city, and they never jar. There's a kind of other geometry that takes over, and I think that's where we started to think about, it was a way of thinking about being above the parapet line that could be more playful, could be more sort of unusual, and yet somehow it would be held together by that thinking. I guess it's kind of tough zinc, and it's slightly reflective, and it ages beautifully. I mean, you can hardly tell the difference between when it was put in 15 years ago and now. And it has a kind of luster without being cheap or attention grabbing. It just has that kind of almost like pewter, that feeling of something precious without being showy. Look, I think if you looked at the footprint of the site itself, it's a very unusual geometry, and we kind of like that. We quite like difficult geometries because it gives you a sort of way of resolving things slightly smoothly. And so technically there's kind of three bands. There's the outdoor space, the big room, and then the smaller spaces and the staircase. But actually the way they are hinged is because of the pinch point at the tip of the site, which actually allows them to sort of flare and wrap around each other. I think it has something to do with how you lock into the neighbouring building and the height limit. So it actually kind of does lift. It sort of starts at a datum and then lifts. But that's a really good question. I don't know. It was always a kind of given of the design, but I don't know. In the beginning it was going to be the bedroom, the master bedroom, but it was too tricky to get all the attendant other stuff that goes with a master bedroom, bathrooms, and so on. But I think there was also a sense that if you have this very big, warehousey, quite industrial scaled room, that you needed a smaller, softer space as a companion. And I think that's my memory is that it was always those two spaces together that were a kind of given. You know, they were never different from I don't think we're ever briefed that way, in a way that this is what we want from the outside and the inside. I think it's a general kind of feeling of, in this case, something that seemed tough from the outside and something that was much softer. It's sort of a soft-shelled, a kind of something that has an armature that protects you from the outside, but from the inside it's something else entirely. That you do feel, not that you're in a tough neighbourhood, but that you're in a very gentle and humane sort of space. We were, at the time that we were doing this, we were doing a house in Hunters Hill, which had a similar strategy. It was also struggling to make outdoor space on a small site and to make it feel as big as possible. But I think in this case, the curve of this deck, there's a kind of 5-to-1, almost like a plateau, where all the other buildings stop, and we, because we could steal all that space, put it up here. And that curve almost feels like it's completed by the 5-to-1 roofs on the outside. And it's a fairly subtle thing, but once you see it, it actually is quite embracing. It has a kind of outward embrace that I think makes it feel like it draws the whole city into that space. It's not just a linear, like a veranda or a courtyard which kind of retreats. It feels like it's sort of, it's a kind of embrace, I think. I guess to the west, it was a much lower and much more purposeful, smaller openings for that reason, that it's west-facing and tough and noisy. And then to the north, because there's a kind of, it's sort of, you can see it, the end of the 5-to-1, and then you're suddenly at the edge of the city, and the towers start, and they're vertical. And so then we said, well, we'll make a vertical opening to the north. And at night, it's very strong, because from the western windows, you get a very strong horizontal, small view. And from here, you get this complete vertical kind of Tower of Lights feel. We actually were very supported by council. I think they were looking for ways to reinvent Surry Hills and looking for a way to attract actually new and committed people to live here. They were interested in the idea of live work. They were interested in the idea of young families moving in, which Daniel and Lyndall at the time were. So we actually were quite supported by council. It really was a surprise to win the Wilkinson, and even more so the Robin Boyd. I mean, it didn't fit the convention of a Wilkinson house or a Robin Boyd house. It wasn't, you know, it was gritty and tough and small by comparison to a lot of the things that are assessed. Yeah, we were surprised. But actually David Marr wrote a beautiful article about the process of the judging, and in some ways it became slightly transparent how the judging process unfolded and how they fell in love with it. So that was lovely to read. Yes, because Daniel's life has changed so much in that time. I mean, he moved in here he moved in here, he lived here for much longer than that. He lived here before the building was renovated. And it suited a young couple. It suited them up to the point where they had one child. So I wasn't surprised. I wouldn't have been surprised if he'd moved on at that point. But he moved his office here, and then he rented it to friends, and it was used to live work in various different ways. There was a fantastic food photographer here for a while. And then he's now donated it to the Institute of Architects for an architect in residence, which, I mean, for us it's fantastic to see that one space can have so many lives. You know, I mean, Neil and I have worked together now for 20 years, and this was very early on in that collaboration, and it's a long and bumpy road, and we work in this quite organic and quite eccentric and sometimes, up and down sort of way. That takes years to develop, I think. I mean, it would be casting my mind back to what it was like then, and I guess we were in the process of developing a way of working together, a sort of shorthand and a way of assessing ideas from each other, and that's a fascinating thing to do, and it continues to be fascinating.